So let's see. I'll talk about these two as you continue to taste them. Tim Mondavi was the winemaker for Robert Mondavi for most of these years. Lucien Ciano made the wine for Rothschild with Tim from 1979 until 1984. And from 85 until 2000, a great winemaker named Patrick Leon worked with Tim Mondavi to make these wines. As they started making the wines, Opus 1 had no winery itself. Opus 1 had no vineyard itself. So these wines, and actually the next one we're going to taste, were all made at Robert Mondavi Winery. And this to me is something that's very interesting. If you try Opus 1 wines from the 1980s, when it was made at Robert Mondavi Winery, you have to imagine and remember that they were making their own red Cabernet Sauvignon. And so the wines from the 80s, because of the proximity, because they were made at Robert Mondavi Winery, I believe that they emphasized the Bordeaux character of the wines more than later years. So the 1980s, these to me have very lovely evolved characters, have the great tea and incense and the smoky characters and the plummy characters and porty characters that come with aged wines. But the beauty of them is they still have a nice acidity. They still have a brightness. They're very light. They're very delicate. But they haven't lost their mouth structure yet. So these wines represent, I think, an example of the fact that those ones can age very nicely. But they also have only 3 grape varietals in them. While the objective is to have all 5 Bordeaux varietals that I just mentioned, when they started, there was no Malbec and there was no Petit Verdot available. So these just have Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, and Cabernet Franc. These 3 on each one. And then someone found that the book that's on your table, if you're interested, has comments on each and every vintage made back to 1979. So these 2 wines represent the early efforts to find that balance of expression. And I think that we're going to see next when we get into the 90s, what they lack is some of the fruit expression, some of the power and depth that comes naturally from Napa in California. And we're trying to find a balance of the expression of California and the structure and restraint that comes from French wines. The other thing that we'll talk about as we go through, and you'll note, it's on the bottle. I don't think we put it here. Yeah, it's on the bottle. This wine, our first wine, is 12.75% alcohol. Very low. We end up at 14.2. And there's a regular gradation increases each and every year. The alcohol goes up. It's a very interesting observation, and one of much debate now in Napa Valley. How high should alcohols be? You can find alcohols in Napa being 15.5%, 16%. I'll tell you a story to show you how much it's changed. In the early 80s, when I was still at UC Davis at wine school, and I was there in the early 80s. And I remember very well a professor told me, which is true, that wines above 14% alcohol are taxed in the United States at a higher rate. He said, but it doesn't matter because wines are never above 14%. and we all said, wait, that's right. Because it was unthinkable at this point that a wine would be this high. And so it's really a good point of discussion, style. Some people are tempted to say it's climate change, warmer temperatures. Some people are tempted to say people following Parker because they want better scores for higher alcohols. Surely it's a combination of those things, except in recent years, we can't say that we've had warmer seasons leading. We can't say that climate change is causing this. Now, that's a different debate, because we believe that climate change is affecting largely, but within the last 5 years, alcohols are chosen by style and by decision, not by hot seasons. So we start at very low alcohol. I believe, again, a comment on the view of California wines, and this may relate to other regions, Australia, other places that make Cabernet wines. When Cabernet Sauvignon is not fully ripened, it has a character, can have a character of green bell pepper, herbaceous character, a green character. Again, in the 80s, when I was at school learning about wine, I had a roommate who wasn't studying wine, and I was learning how to smell and taste, and I told him that Napa Cabernet smelled like green bell pepper. And I just assumed it did because it did. And he said, no. And I took a bell pepper and cut it up in a bag, and I had him smell the bag, and then smell the wine. Oh, yeah, he found it. But my point of that story is that in the early 80s, we all just assumed that Napa smelled like green bell pepper. That was the character. And now, in the 90s and 2000s, any hint of bell pepper, any hint of unripeness is rejected by the trade, and seemingly not as desired by consumers, irrespective of Robert Parker. So all of the grape growers and all of the winemakers look for what we call phenolic maturity or total ripeness. And that total ripeness means you have to wait, leave the grapes on the vines longer to get the green, the ripe tannins and the full flavors. And as you leave the grapes on longer, you have to have more sugar. And unless you take the sugar out, which hurts the quality, you have higher alcohol. So one of the things, we'll talk about this in our recent years, in recent wines, we're working very hard to try and make a wine in Napa that is fully ripe, fully phenolically ripe, but comes in at or below 14% alcohol. And I'll tell you how we're trying to do that, but that's the challenge. It's easy to make a wine in Napa that's fully ripe at 15.5 or 16. So that's the alcohol story. It's an important story. As we taste through, we're going to go to the next two wines. We jump to 13% alcohol, 13.5.